Okay, so welcome to the UCSB Lagoon. That's what we have here in the background. It's a really beautiful morning this morning, and we're going to take a walk around the lagoon. The lagoon here is not actually naturally full of water. So if you were here 200 years ago or so, you would just see a giant salt flat. It doesn't actually have any natural inputs of water. So the water in the lagoon is artificial. It comes mostly from the Marine Science Building. They have an outflow from their marine aquaria, and then there's also some storm drains from campus that drain into it. So the lagoon itself is quite salty because it used to be a salt flat. So a lot of the plants that we're going to see around the lagoon today are going to be very, very salt tolerant. We're going to talk about two major adaptations that plants use to deal with salt. So we'll talk about how one strategy is to excrete the salt on the surface of the leaves, and one strategy is actually to store the salt in really succulent tissue. And we'll see both types of plants today. All right, so before we get started on new plants, there's going to be a lot of review plants on this hike, so it'll be a really good opportunity to do a little bit of review of the plants that we've already seen this quarter. So first, we have the Douglas's nightshade, which is Solanum douglasii. Remember that this is in the Solanaceae, or the nightshade or potato family. And this plant has white flowers. So we see white flowers here, fused petals, 5 white petals, so Solanum douglasii, alternate phyllotaxy, very characteristic of the Solanaceae family, and simple undivided leaf blades. And this plant here does have a few fruits, so remember the flowers will develop into fruits. And in this case, they turn into little berries, right? So this is related to a tomato. It's in the same genus as tomato, Solanum douglasii. And these will eventually, they're not ripe yet, they'll eventually turn black. So this will have black berries when they're mature. All right, so we have a few other plants to show you here. So one other review plant is this plant here. We've got yellow ray flowers and brown disc flowers, and these leaves with palmate venation. So 3 main veins on the undersides of the leaves there. So this plant is Encelia californica, the California brittle bush, or the California bush daisy. Encelia californica, a member of this nice coastal scrub community that you see here. And then one last plant on our review here is this gray shrub. This gray shrub here with these very needle-like leaves. Some of them are quite forked, and this smells really nice. And this is Artemisia californica. All right, so here we have another review plant. This plant is covered in prickles. You can see prickles all along the stem of this plant. So remember, prickles are epidermal outgrowths. They're not associated with a node like a spine or a thorn. So covered in prickles. And the leaves here, the leaves are simple here, but sometimes this plant can also have palmately compound leaves where we would see 3 leaflets instead of just 1 here. And there's the flower of this plant. We can see it's got 5 white petals, many stamens, and those are all classic Rosaceae features. So all features of the rose family. And this plant here is the California blackberry, Rubus ursinus. One of the plants that occurs oftentimes along the edges of riparian or very wet habitats. So we're right along the edge of the lagoon here where this plant is getting plenty of water. You can see that it's vining up over some of the shrubs here. So Rubus ursinus. And we also wanted to show you this really fun plant. It's not on your list, but it's a very neat plant that you only get to see in the springtime. And it's this plant right here. So this plant is one of our native orchids in California. This is the stream orchid, Epipactis gigantea. Again, not on your list, but we wanted to show you. We do have some native orchid species in California. This is in the orchid family, the Orchidaceae, which is one of the largest families in the world. So really neat plant here. All right, so here we have another review plant, this gray shrub here, another member of the coastal scrub community. And I'm gonna pull off a single leaf here so we can take a look at some of the features of the leaf itself. So we have these kind of triangular leaves with the 2 points down here at the end. It looks a little bit like a duck foot. And this is in the Chenopodiaceae, or the duckfoot family, or goosefoot family. And this is Atriplex lentiformis, the quail bush. And when we were first introduced to this plant, it was not flowering, but it is flowering here. So we've got a cluster of flowers. These are actually male flowers. So this plant can either be monoecious or dioecious. It looks like I'm only seeing male flowers here that are producing pollen. We'll try and see if we can find some female flowers, but you can see this is actually an inflorescence, or a cluster of many flowers together. It's wind pollinated, so it's not very showy or exciting. So just these kind of terminal clusters of flowers on the quail bush, Atriplex lentiformis. So here we have a new plant. It's another member of the coastal scrub community, and I'll introduce it and then we can get some close-up shots of this plant. This is called the coast buckwheat. Coast buckwheat is in the genus Eriogonum, and the specific epithet for this species is parvifolium. So Eriogonum parvifolium. And I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the features of this plant up close. So first, what we have here is a cluster of terminal flowers. They're pink and white, and they actually have 6 petals, which is very strange. It's a dicot, but they do have 6 petals, so that is a little bit odd and out of ordinary for dicots. So they has these typical cluster of pink flowers that's fairly typical of plants in the genus Eriogonum. And then I'll show you the leaves here. So the leaves are triangular shaped. Sometimes they have a bit of red on them as they age, and you can see that especially later in the season. As the plant ages, it'll look a little bit red because of that red color on the leaves. But what I wanted to point out especially is the undersides of these leaves, which you can see are white, and that color comes from hairs, very dense woolly hairs on the undersides of these leaves. And if you see the margins, they're slightly rolled under. We call those margins revolute. So rolled under margins we call revolute margins. So these triangular leaves, very fuzzy bottoms to the leaves. And you can see here is the plant itself, part of the coastal scrub community. This is a very coastal species, so you won't see it up in the mountains. You'll see it pretty much just right on the coast here. And we can point out a couple other coastal scrub species that you'll see here. So we've got the coast buckwheat, and we also have lemonade berry, Ruis integrifolia. You can see some of these flattened fruits, and you could also see the rounded leaf tips, very typical of lemonade berry, rounded leaf tips, Ruis integrifolia in the Anacardiaceae family. So we've got Ruis integrifolia. Then we also have some Artemisia californica, so the California sagebrush there. And what we are standing on here is actually a transition zone. So we see this nice coastal scrub community up on the hills, and we're in this transition zone or ecotone where 2 plant communities merge up on each other between a coastal scrub and a salt marsh community. So all of these lower mat plants are salt marsh plants. They're very, very salt tolerant. You can actually see as we're walking around, we'll show you there's some salt on the ground. You can tell there's a lot of salt in this environment. And salt is tough for plants. They don't really like growing in the salt. It makes the there's less available water to them because of the salt. So there's different ways that plants can deal with being in these really, really salty environments. And one strategy is to absorb salt out of the environment, store that salt in your vacuoles, and basically make yourself saltier than the environment around you. That way water will flow into you. So that strategy is called a salt accumulator. Oftentimes those plants are very succulent, and we'll see an example of one here. And the other strategy is called salt excretion or salt excretors. And those plants are oftentimes not very succulent, but they will actually take salt, and then they have special glands on the surface of their leaves, and they'll excrete that salt, and it'll form crystals on the surface of the leaves. So we have two examples, or both examples here. I'll introduce you to our first salt marsh plant, which is called pickleweed. This plant is very succulent, and it is a salt accumulator. So if I were to taste a little bit of this plant, it's very salty. So there's a lot of salt accumulated inside of this plant. This is actually sold in the grocery store sometimes as sea beans. You can get it when the stems are fresh and tender, and it's not bad in a stir fry. So this is pickleweed. The scientific name is Salicornia pacifica. So salicornia means salty horn. So sal, like saline, is salty, and cornea means horn, and that refers to kind of the shapes of these stems. So this plant is really interesting because it is mostly stem tissue that you're seeing. The stem tissue is what's accumulating the salt and accumulating the succulents, and it's what's also doing the photosynthesis. So you can see that we have individual stems here, and at these segments, which are nodes, there are branches that form. So we have individual branches forming off of this plant, and each one of these segments, like I said, is a node. And there are two tiny, tiny little leaves there, one on each side. They're kind of clear. So this doesn't really have much leaves, but there are two per node essentially. So two tiny, tiny little clear leaves per node. And this plant is wind pollinated, and we had found some flowers earlier, but I don't see any now. We'll find some more flowers for you, and we'll take a look at those. Look at those. But in the pickleweed, so we have pickleweed, and then we have this grass here. So pickleweed and a grass. So these are the two salt marsh plants that are in this area. And this grass is salt grass, aptly named salt grass. And the scientific name is Distichylus spicata. And it is a true grass. It's in the Poaceae family. You can see that there's one leaf per node, and it has parallel leaf venation. And this plant uses an alternate strategy to deal with the salt. So instead of accumulating it in really succulent stems, this plant actually excretes salt onto the surface of the leaf. And it's a little bit difficult to see without a hand lens, but this plant is covered in tiny little salt crystals. There's one right there. If you could try and get it, I don't know, we might not be able to get that, but there's some on the surface of the leaves. So if you were actually to taste the surface of the leaves, they would taste very salty because it's actually excreting crystals of salt on the surface of the leaf. So we have saltgrass here and pickleweed here. Both plants are very well adapted to dealing with this very, very salty environment, but they use different strategies. So we have one salt accumulator and one salt excreter. And we will see more plants in the salt marsh community. All of them have a very similar habit in that they are low-growing perennial herbs, meaning that they live year after year, but they don't ever create any wood or secondary growth. And they're all rhizomatous, so they're spreading via rhizomes in this environment. Okay, so here we are on the very edge of the lagoon. This is part of the environment that is quite salty, and I'm actually going to have Devin show you on the ground here. This white substance on the ground is actually salt, right? There's a lot of salt in this soil, and you can see it actually accumulating on the surface of the soil. So that gives you a sense that we're in a very salty environment. You don't see any of those coastal scrub species right on the margin of the salt marsh because they're not quite salt tolerant enough to deal with the salt. But we do have some of the plants we just learned. So we have some pickleweed here, Salicornia pacifica in the Amaranthaceae family. And what you'll notice is that it's covered in this orange fiber, and that orange fiber is actually a plant. It's a parasitic plant, and it's in the, it's called dodder, D-O-D-D-E-R, and it's in the genus Cuscuta. So this is one of the plants, again, you only need to know to genus. There's quite a few species of dodder. This is a dodder that's specifically very salt tolerant, but you'll see these kind of orange hairs all over California on plants that they parasitize. And they are entirely parasitic, so they have no green tissue. They're not doing any of their own photosynthesis. They are attaching to their hosts via hostoria, right? Essentially a tap that goes right into their vascular tissue and steals all of their sugars from the plants that they're parasitizing. So dodder in the genus Cuscuta. And what's really great about the dodder is right now it's actually flowering. So I'm going to pull a couple flowers out here. So all of these white flowers are dodder flowers. So it's in full bloom right now. Even though it doesn't have any chlorophyll, it can still produce flowers, and it is an angiosperm, and it's actually related to one of the plants we've already learned. It's in the Convolvulaceae, so it's related to the morning glory or the calisthesia. So that is the beautiful the beautiful dodder flowers there. And I'm going to show you one other plant in the salt marsh. You'll see it's right along the edge here, and the dodder is also parasitizing this plant here. So this plant here, I'm going to grab a couple more. This plant here is called alkali heath. You can see it's growing as this low kind of carpet here. Again, rhizomatous plant growing via rhizomes as this mat. Alkali heath is Frankenia salina, and again, the scientific name or the specific epithet salina refers to the fact that this plant grows in very, very saline environments. And the dodder is colonizing this plant, but I'm going to show you just one of the stems here so we can get a look at some of the features. So this is a plant that's not very succulent, so it's a salt excreter instead of a salt accumulator. It does have little salt crystals on the surface, but they might be a little bit difficult to see in the video. But what I do want to point out to you is it has opposite leaf arrangement or opposite phyllotaxy. There's 2 leaves per node there, and there are some branches starting to grow out of the axillary buds there. And the leaves are actually folded under on each other. So again, revolute leaves or revolute leaf margins. They're kind of upside down tacos there on along the stem there. So all of this again is the Frankenia salina. You can see that it's being colonized a bit by the parasitic dodder here. We see some of the pickleweed, the Salicornia pacifica, and you can really nicely see some of those the white flowers on the dodder. All right, so we have a review plant here, which is the California sagebrush. And remember that I told you it's in the sunflower family or the Asteraceae family. So we would expect that it has these characteristic head-like inflorescences. And sure enough, here they are. So we found some that are blooming. You can see that there are clusters of inflorescences here. So each one of these structures is an individual head composed of many disc flowers. So these are discoid heads. They don't have any ray flowers, but they do have disc flowers. So you can see that indeed this plant is in the Asteraceae family. All right, so we have another review plant here. This is a summer flowering aster plant, and we've got a stem here with sessile leaves, so leaves attached directly to the stem without a petiole, and they're fairly hairy. There's hairs on the leaves, hairs on the stems. There are some teeth on the margins. This is Isocoma menziesii, the coast golden bush, and I'm going to show you some of the old inflorescence clusters here. So these are last year's or this past summer's inflorescence cluster. You can see that there are still some fruits on here. So we've got some fruits there. You see there's a little tiny akene seed at the bottom and a bit of modified sepal tissue or modified calyx tissue that helps this plant disperse. So it looks a little bit like dandelion seeds on the fruits there. All right, so we have another new plant here. This shrub right next to the lagoon is called mule fat, and it is in the genus Baccharis, so it's closely related to the coyote brush. Baccharis, this is Baccharis salicifolia, and salicifolia means salix-like leaves. So salix is the genus of willows. We learned about willows. They have these long, simple leaves. And so this plant, even though it's not related to a willow, has leaves that look a little bit like willow. So the specific epithet means willow-like leaves, salicifolia, or salix-like leaves. And you can see they're arranged alternately, one per node, these simple glabrous leaves. They have no hairs on them, but one single kind of main vein there. And like I said, this plant is in the genus Baccharis, so that means it's in the same family as Baccharis pilearis, which is the Asteraceae family. So I'm going to show you some of the flowers here. They are white and they are heads, right? So it's in the sunflower family. These are head inflorescences. They only have disc flowers. They do not have any ray flowers, so disc inflorescences on the mule fat here. All right, so here we wanted to take a look at some of the distribution of the species we've talked about. We have one of our plants, the coil bush, the Atriplex lentiformis. This is a coastal scrub species. And as we move closer to the lagoon, as we're getting saltier and saltier, we have a different zonation of species as we're getting closer, and that zonation depends on how salt tolerant they are. So close to the salt bush, we have some salt grass here, so Distichula spicata. And then as we're moving closer, we're picking up some of this alkali heath, the Frankenia salina. And then as we get closer to the edge of the lagoon, most of the organisms that you see here are pickleweed, right? So this very, very salt tolerant pickleweed species is what's really occurring on the edges of the lagoon. So very salt tolerant, salt accumulating species. And then I also wanted to point out the islands here. So the islands on the lagoon are covered in very, very salt tolerant species. I see there's some pickleweed and some Frankenia salina out there. And these islands on the lagoon are actually artificial. They were created for shorebird habitat. So the birds really like hanging out on those islands in the center of the lagoon, but they are artificial. Okay, we have another review plant. You guys have maybe had lunch under these trees before. These are right outside of the UCSB, and they have this very characteristic white-gray mottled bark. And if we were to go up there, we would see they have palmately lobed large leaves, and these are California sycamore trees, so Platanus racemosa, another review species. We first were introduced to these in the riparian areas, so they do need quite a bit of water. They're pretty happy on this irrigated grass, but they have that very characteristic white bark. It makes them fairly easy to identify. Okay, we have a review plant here, this vine that's growing up on the fence with this beautiful white corolla. And I'll show you one of the leaves, one of these characteristic sagittate leaves. This is the morning glory Calistegia macrostegia in the Convolvulaceae family. So we just met one of its cousins, the daughter, which has similar white tubular flowers. So both of those plants, the daughter and the morning glory, in the same family, the Convolvulaceae family. All right, this is not a plant on your list, but it is in one of your required plant families. So you should be able to recognize what plant family this is in based on some of the features that I'm going to show you. So first, this let's take a look at the flower. It has a large banner flower up on the top, this large purple flower, and then it has a couple other petals here hiding the reproductive organs on the inside. But this very characteristic large banner flower. And then I will show you individual leaves here. So here's a single leaf. It is compound, pinnately compound leaf, and it does have some stipules down at the bottom. So those little appendages down at the bottom, right where the leaf attaches to the stem. So pinnately compound leaf with stipules, a flower with a large banner petal, and if this plant were to develop fruits, or if we could find any fruits on this plant, they would be legumes. So this is in the pea family, or the Fabaceae family. All right, we've got another new plant here. It is another salt marsh plant, quite low growing, matted plant. Looks very similar to the other plants that we've seen so far, at least from a distance. But I'll show you up close so you can see some of the features of this plant. So this plant is called fleshy Jaumea. The scientific name is Jaumea carnosa. And this plant has opposite leaves, so you can see very clearly 2 leaves per node there. They are quite succulent, so this is another one of the salt accumulators. This is a salt marsh plant, can do very well in very salty environments because it accumulates salt in these fleshy leaves here. And this plant is actually in the aster family. When it's flowering, it'll have little yellow inflorescences, little yellow head inflorescences, and we'll keep an eye out for some. We haven't seen any yet, but we might be able to find some in a little bit, and we will film those if we see any. So fleshy Jaumea carnosa. Okay, we have a review plant here. It's very wet, so we would expect plants that grow where it's very wet to be occurring here. And this plant is one of our review plants. It's got these long, simple leaves. And this is a willow or salix. And there's still some flowers on the salix. So these are inflorescences, catkin inflorescences. And we talked about how willows are dioecious, meaning that individuals are either male or female, and this is a male individual. These are catkins that are producing pollen, and a different individual would be producing catkins with carpels and pistils. All right, we have another review plant. We don't want to get too close because it's a bit marshy over there. But up in this assemblage of coastal scrub, there is the California rose. So Rosa californica. It has pinnately compound leaves, prickles all along the stem, and 5 pink petals with many stamens. So classic characteristics of the rose family: 5 petals, many stamens, pinnately compound leaves with some kind of prickles on them. All right, we have another review plant here. It's this low-growing plant with the purple flowers. We can see that there are 6 petals on these purple flowers with a yellow center. And we can see that it has linear sword-shaped leaves with linear parallel venation. And so that indicates to you that this plant is a monocot. And this is blue-eyed grass, Cicericium bellum. All right, we have a new plant here. This is a non-native species with the yellow flowers. You can see there's an entire field of it behind me, and oftentimes in the springtime it can really take over different habitats. This is the Bermuda buttercup, or I learned it as a kid as sour grass. You might have learned it as that. This is Oxalis pescaprae, and Oxalis is the genus that refers to the oxalic acid that gives it that very sour flavor. If you ever chewed on this as a kid, that's oxalic acid inside of the plant. And pescaprae means foot of a goat. I'm gonna go ahead and show you one of the leaves here before I show you the flower up more closely. So this is a single leaf of the Bermuda buttercup, or the Oxalis pescaprae. And it is a compound leaf, so it's palmately compound. You can see there are 3 heart-shaped leaflets there, all attached at a single point at the tip of the petiole. And these leaflets kind of look a little bit like the foot of a goat. That's how it gets its name, Oxalis pescaprae. So oxalis, again, from the acid inside the tissue, and then pescaprae means foot of a goat. And I'll show you the flower here. So this plant produces an inflorescence, and it's an umbel inflorescence. We have many flowers attached to a single point at the tip of this pedicel. And the flowers themselves have 5 very glossy, silky yellow petals. And I'll go ahead and dissect these. They're fused at the base. And there is a set of stamens in the center, and then there is a pistil or a carpel in the very center of those. So we have reproductive organs in here, both stamens and pistils. So these are perfect flowers. All right, we have a new plant here. This is one of the plants that you will only need to know to genus, and these are the lupins. So the genus is Lupinus. And they have very similar characteristics in this genus. So one is they have palmately compound leaves. So here's a single leaf, and it has multiple leaflets attached to a single point at the tip of the petiole. So palmately lobed, or palmately compound leaves. And this plant is in the pea family, or the Fabaceae family. So it's got some of the typical pea characteristics. It has a banner petal here. So members of the pea family have this characteristic banner petal, oftentimes functions for pollinator attraction. And they have 5 total petals. So they have 1 banner petal and these 2 side petals here. And then there is 2 petals kind of fused together into this keel that is covering up some of the reproductive organs on the inside. So you can see there's some pollen there coming out. So 5 petals on the members of the pea family, including this very characteristic banner petal. And the lupins produce flowers in racemes. So this is an inflorescence, a single inflorescence. There's no branching, with flowers attached to it, and those flowers do have pedicels, right? So little stalks that attach them to the main inflorescence stalk. And there are many species of lupins in California, and they fall kind of into two main groups. Some of them are annuals, or plants that only live for a single year, and some of them are perennials, and we'll actually see both types today. This is an annual lupin. So this plant will grow, flower, doesn't make any secondary growth, and it'll produce seeds that will survive the summer in the soil. And then we'll see another plant, an annual lupin, or sorry, a perennial lupin that lives year after year. It's more of a shrub. It's got a lot of secondary growth on it. But both plants, both types of lifespans have very similar characteristics. So the palmately compound leaves, the pea flowers produced in a raceme, and then it is in the pea family, so it does make legume fruits. So these are the fruits. They're just starting to form. We're a little bit early for the fruits, but they create these pea fruits just like a sugar snap pea, one chamber on the inside, and they will eventually dry up and split open. Okay, we have a review plant here. It's kind of this shrub that's amalgamated with some of the other shrubs, but the one that we're really interested in has these small yellow flowers. Small yellow flowers, palmately compound leaves, and these flowers have the typical pea family flower shape. They've got a banner petal and those keel petals coming out of the bottom. So we know that this is in the pea family or the Fabaceae family, and this is deerweed, Acmispon glaber. Okay, we have another lupin here, so another plant in the genus Lupinus, and we showed you the first one, which was an annual lupin, only lives for a single year, and this is one of the perennial or bush lupins. It has secondary growth, so it actually goes through secondary growth, creates secondary xylem, creates wood, but it has very similar characteristics. So we talked about how lupins have palmately compound leaves. So here we have a single leaf, many leaflets attached at the tip of the petiole. It has these purple flowers in a raceme. So purple flowers in a raceme, very classic pea flowers with the banner petal there. And it is in the pea family, so it does create pea fruits. So this one has some fruits that are a little bit further along. So here are the fruits, and you can see the seeds on the inside are starting to develop there. And again, these are still unripe, so they're not ripe. Once the fruits become ripe, they actually dry up, so they're dry fruits, and they dehisce, meaning that they split open. So these are last year's fruits that are on this plant, and they've split up, they've dried out, they've split open, and they have since released all of the seeds on the inside there. So this plant is fairly common in the coastal scrub, and it is another one of the drought deciduous species. So if you were to walk by this plant in the summertime, you would just kind of see some dry sticks here, almost a dead looking plant. But as soon as those winter rains come, it starts to really perk up, and it'll start to flower and fruit. All right, we have a review plant here. So these individual stalks coming up out of the ground. It has opposite leaves, triangularly shaped leaves. And let's take a look at the flowers themselves. So they have these little red flowers there, look like little opera boxes. So this is Scrophularia californica, the California figwort. All right, so we are here in a restored part of the lagoon. We're out on the southern part of the lagoon, and all of this area has been restored. So a lot of this used to be ice plant. We will introduce you to ice plant in a little bit. You're probably very familiar with that plant. You've seen it around the beaches here, but the management here has taken some really dramatic steps. So one of the restoration tactics that they've used for this property is controlled burns. So because we are kind of on this little contained island and the fire won't spread, they did use a controlled burn, and that was good practice for the fire department as well. So they burned this area and have been replanting it with some locally sourced genotypes of shrubs like the lupin, the lupinus, as well as the calisthesia. So we have our morning glory with these beautiful white flowers, and we also have some coast buckwheat here. So Eriogonum parvifolium. All right, we have a new plant here. This is a non-native species. This is wild radish, so not native to California. It is in the Brassicaceae, or the mustard family, and it's got some characteristics of the mustard family here. So we talked about how the mustard family flowers have 4 petals, and you can see those 4 petals there very nicely. And those 4 petals are not fused together. So those 4 petals are free from each other, so not fused together. And again, there's no fusion in these flowers. So it has 4 sepals that are not fused, 4 petals that are not fused, and then it has a set of 6 stamens on the inside of the flower, and a single pistil that will eventually develop into a silique or a pod-like fruit. And this plant is similar to the sea rocket that we met out at Colo Point, in that it has fruits that are a little bit more fleshy or swollen. So there are some of the fruits on this plant. Those are not quite ripe. They will eventually dry up. They'll eventually get a little bit bigger, and then they'll dry up and become brown. But this family produces flowers along a raceme. So we have a single flower stalk here. It's not branched, and the flowers do have pedicels, little stalks that attach them to the stalk. And let's take a look at some of the leaves here. So we see there's quite a bit of red along the stem, and it does have compound leaves. So here's an individual leaf. There are some leaflets, and this plant is actually the same species as a radish, like if you were to buy in the grocery store, but radishes in the grocery store have undergone quite a bit of selection, artificial selection, to bulk up the root to make it more radish-like. But it is the same species. Okay, we are in a little bit of restored dune habitat, so the soil here is quite sandy. So we see some of the pioneer dune species that we met out at Colo Point, including this individual right here. So we have these very fuzzy gray leaves and these beautiful yellow flowers with 4 petals. Yellow flowers with 4 petals, and once they are pollinated, they become more of this orange color. So this is Camisoniopsis cheiranthifolia, the dune evening primrose, or the beach evening primrose. All right, we are still here on the dune, so you can see we've got a little hummock here of matted plants, and there's a couple species that you should recognize here. So we have this purple flowering species. It's got opposite succulent leaves that are covered in sand. It's quite sticky. That is the beach sand verbena, or the abronia. Remember, you only need to know that plant to genus. And we also have this plant here with the succulent gray leaves, opposite leaf arrangement. Here is a single leaf there. That is the beach burr or beach burr sage, Ambrosia Chamasonis. All right, so this is a new plant. You can see that it's this mat species completely covering the dunes here. This is the non-native species, and it's considered invasive, so it's been taking over our ecosystems. And I'm gonna have Devin show you kind of a comparison between the two habitats. Over here, we've got a restored dune habitat on the left. So that is what a native, natural dune habitat looks like in this part of California. And on the right here, we have dunes that are entirely covered with this ice plant, or Carpobrotus. So it's in the genus Carpobrotus. We're gonna have you only recognize this plant to genus. And you can see that it's completely covering the dunes. There's almost no native vegetation here, and it's just the ice plant. So this plant, again, not native to California. This is introduced from South Africa, but it does fairly well in salty habitats. It has quite succulent leaves, and they're arranged oppositely. So 2 leaves per node there. And they are triangular in cross section. So you can see there's this kind of keel at the bottom of the leaf, and they are triangular in cross section there. So quite succulent on the inside. And I'll go ahead and show you the flowers. So this plant is in a family called the Eosaceae, not a plant family that you need to know the features of necessarily, but here is a single flower. It's got many petals, kind of these silky purple petals, many stamens, yellow stamens on the inside. And I'm gonna go ahead and pull some of these off here. All right, I've pulled away the petals here, and I'm pulling away the stamens. And you can see there's this green stigma in the center, and this entire green disc here is the ovary. So that will eventually develop into a fruit. And the ice plant has purple flowers, like I just showed you, but it also has yellow flowers. So I'm gonna come over here and show you one of the yellow flowers. They're both in the same genus, so Carpobrotus, or ice plant. There's actually a few species in California, but they hybridize, so it's a little bit difficult to tell them apart. But sometimes flowers can be purple, and sometimes flowers can be yellow. All right, we have a review plant here, this giant grass. So very large grass. Here is the inflorescence of that grass. So this is giant wild rye, Elymus condensatus, a member of the coastal scrub community. All right, here we have another new plant. This is probably a plant that you recognize, the California poppy. Scientific name is Eschscholzia californica, and this one might look a little bit different from the poppies that you have seen before or seen on some of our state materials. So these are not entirely orange. They have some yellow out at the tip here, and that's because these are a special variety of poppy. They're local to our coastal area here in Goleta, and they have some adaptations that help them survive in this area. So in Goleta, it can get quite foggy, especially in the summertime, and these plants are very resistant to mildew, so they will not get covered in a white mildewy substance that can really damage the plant and prevent it from doing a lot of photosynthesis. So I'm going to go ahead and dissect this flower open. It has 4 petals. That's pretty standard for this plant's family, the Papaveraceae. It's got some orange stamens in the very center there that are producing pollen. I'm gonna pull off the petals so we can take a look at the inside of the flower here. So in the very center of the flower, there is the pistil. So there is this forked stigma and then that green ovary down at the base. And that ovary will eventually develop into a fruit. So here is an immature fruit. It will eventually dry up and split open, and it's full of black seeds, just like you would find in your poppy seed muffin on the inside. So it is a dehiscent fruit that will split open at maturity. And I'm gonna grab a leaf so I can show you some of the leaves here. So here's a branch from the poppy, and there are a couple leaves here. This is an individual leaf. You can see it's fairly highly dissected and feathery, so a compound leaf there. And this plant occurs along the coast. So it's fairly mild along the coast all year, and this plant is actually a perennial, meaning that it'll live year after year, as opposed to the poppies that you might find inland in Antelope Valley and places like that, where those very, very bright orange poppies are annual. They will germinate, grow, reproduce, and die all within a year, and then the seeds will survive in the soil during the summer. Okay, we have another new plant here. This is yarrow. Yarrow is in the Asteraceae family. It's made up of little heads, and we'll get a close-up shot on those heads in a minute, but I want to show you some of the features of this plant, starting with the leaves. So the scientific name of this plant is Achillea millefolium, and millefolium, the specific epithet, means 1,000 leaves, and it refers to these very highly divided leaves. So this is an individual leaf here, highly divided into leaflets. And Achillea is the genus. It's named after Achilles. This plant occurs all around the world, is native to many places in the world, including here in California. And the story goes that yarrow is a medicinal plant. It's used as a blood coagulant, and Achilles, when he was in war, would put some of this plant under his armor when he was injured, and it would help to coagulate his blood. So that's where it gets its name, Achillea, the genus name Achillea. And you can see really clearly there that there are multiple inflorescences. Each one of those heads has some ray flowers, some white ray flowers, and a cluster of little disc flowers in the very center there. And this is kind of an umbel type inflorescence. It's got a bit of a flat top. Yarrow also smells very nice. It is a kind of chamomile type smell. It is related a little bit to chamomile. Chamomile is in the Asteraceae family. But if you ever see this plant around, I encourage you to smell some of its leaves. Okay, we have another new plant here. This cactus is what we're going to be focusing on here with these flat pads. This is a plant that you need to know to genus. It's in the genus Opuntia. So you only need to know to genus. There's quite a few species of Opuntia, but they all have very similar characteristics. They have these flat pads, and the flat pads are the stem of the plant. So they are the succulent stem of the plant, these flat pads. And then the stem itself is doing the bulk of the photosynthesis. That's what tissue is green. And all over the stem there are nodes. So each one of these individual structures is a node, and there are modified leaves called spines coming out of each one of those nodes. The cactus, this Opuntia is in the cactus family, the Cactaceae, which is one of your required plant families. So I'll go over some of the features of the Cactaceae. We'll take a look at this flower here. We've got two flowers on the cactus. This one is open right now. You can see it has many, many petals. The sepals grade into petals, so we can call those tepals. You can't really tell the difference between them. So many tepals, many stamens on the inside, and then we'll go ahead and come to this flower here, and what you'll notice is that the ovary is inferior. So this green structure here is the ovary of the flower, and it is attached below the petals there, so it has an inferior ovary. And that ovary, once it becomes pollinated and fertilized, will develop into a fruit. And we can go over to this Opuntia here to see some of the fruits. So here is the cactus fruit. They will eventually swell up a little bit, become colored. Those cactus fruits are pretty tasty if you can get all of the tiny little hairs off of the cactus there. And there's if you ever had a dragon fruit before, a dragon fruit is in the cactus family. It is a fruit very similar to this. So Opuntia, again, is one of your required plants, and you only need to know this plant genus. And these are the cacti that have these flat paddle-like stems.